and that is by looking closely at the global carbon cycle. This is a simplified version of the global carbon cycle, and CO2 in the atmosphere, and these numbers here are the major sources and sinks of CO2 into the atmosphere. Photosynthesis removes huge amounts, 120 billion tons of carbon a year, and that comes right back as respiration or decomposition in the soil. So some of that plant material goes to the soil, it builds up soil organic carbon, which we'll come back to later, and that decomposed, it goes back to the atmosphere, and that whole land cycle is basically in balance. And there's a similar cycle in the ocean of CO2 that gets mixed in by the winds and waves into the ocean, and it gets taken up by the marine life. And again, a lot of CO2 gets mixed in, a lot gets mixed back out. It depends on the winds and waves. And that, again, basically in balance. So what humans have done and what we've done to destabilize the global carbon cycle is here in the center. It's anthropogenic sources of CO2, where we're taking carbon that was in the ground and putting it into the atmosphere. And the two ways we do that are by fossil fuel combustion, by burning coal and oil and natural gas, turning it into CO2, taking it out of the ground, putting it into the atmosphere, and then by cutting down and burning down forests faster than they can grow back. So those are the anthropogenic sources. And right now in the Global Climate Treaty Convention, those are the only things countries need to count for, is anthropogenic sources. They don't need to count for anything else. The fossil fuel combustion numbers are well known. Deforestation is hard to hide these days with satellites. So these numbers are well known. But they don't have to count for anything else. And as you can see, that means throwing away 98 or 99% of the CO2 cycle as a management tool. Point is, we can't stabilize CO2 if we take the entire carbon cycle into account, all the sources and things going in and out. But in fact, countries have chosen only to look at this tiny little part in the center. And that's a very serious omission from the Climate Change Convention that was not in the original treaty. In the original treaty in 1989, when the first draft of the Climate Change Convention was being written, I was a senior scientific affairs officer for global climate change and biodiversity issues at the United Nations Center for Science and Technology for Development. And I got that draft treaty on my desk to review, to see whether it was scientifically sound and met the needs of the country. So the first draft was prepared by the United Nations staff, and then it was given to governments to negotiate. And in that treaty, I put in there that the treaty would require countries to account for all greenhouse gas sources and sinks, CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, so we could know what was going in, know what was going out, and figure out how to balance it in a stable way. And without having complete accounting, that would have been impossible. And it also said that one of the purposes of the Climate Change Convention was to protect Earth's most critical climatically sensitive ecosystems, such as coral reefs. Now, all of that got taken out. When the treaty went from the UN to governments, it was a much better treaty than came back to the UN. So governments went and they cut out everything they didn't like, and they didn't want to account for anything but fossil fuels and deforestation. So that's the only thing they accounted for, and they threw everything else out and ignored that. And that meant that soil organic carbon was not included in the treaty as it should have been at the very beginning, and as was written into it. Soil organic carbon has 5 times more carbon, nearly 5 times more than all of the biota or the atmosphere. And that's a major pool that exchanges rapidly with the atmosphere that we can control, because we can't control the mixing and going into the sea. That's driven by the winds and waves, and we can't control the waves. So that's really beyond our control. This is what we can manage here, is to manage so that we have more photosynthesis and restore the carbon in the ground instead of oxidizing, burning it, and removing it. So worldwide, we have destroyed about half of the carbon in the biomass. All the living trees and whales and coral reefs that we've destroyed has reduced at least half of the original amount of carbon that was in living things. We don't even really have a good idea how much, because in most cases we've destroyed the ecosystem so thoroughly there's no trace left of how they were. But we've definitely lost about half at least. And then of the forests that we've cut down and cleared for agriculture, pasture, we've lost about half the carbon in the soil, because we've managed that in a degraded way. We've burned that off. We're using up that carbon, turning it into CO2 as we drain the land, draining it and using it up. So we've made the situation worse. But at the same time, once we understand the whole carbon cycle, we see that the only thing we can do to manage it in a positive way is to increase photosynthesis and soil organic carbon in various forms. And that's what we call the down-to-earth solution to global climate change, to take that dangerous excess of CO2 out of the atmosphere where it is doing the most harm it possibly could and put it back into the ground where it came from, where it will do the most good. Because soil organic carbon is not just a storage, it's a dynamic factor that drives the very life of the soil itself. The organic carbon in the soil retains water, retains nutrients. It becomes a medium in which the fungi and the bacteria grow and pass the nutrients on directly to the plant roots. And so that organic carbon becomes the basis of a very dynamic ecosystem that makes the whole ecosystem more productive. This shows the kind of carbon trading that we need to do. The red is, this is the amount of CO2 carbon in the atmosphere in gigatons of carbon, billion tons. And the red is the dangerous excess that we have to remove. We're 40% too high already. So we need to draw down that dangerous excess here in red, take it up by the vegetation, planting trees as quickly and aggressively as we can in areas that are graded, and then storing that carbon in the ground. And the methods for doing that are well established, and we only need to increase the amount of carbon in the soil by a small amount, under 10%, to get rid of that excess dangerous CO2. And in doing so, we'll make the soil more fertile, we'll have more food, and the soil will hold more water and recharge the groundwater aquifers. It'll solve a lot of our water problems, which are overwhelming us all over the world. So when we look at the entire carbon cycle, we consider all the sources and sinks. There are only certain components that really are ones that we can affect. I say the ocean isn't one. We hear a lot of talk about people dumping fertilizer in the ocean. But the fact is, the things that grow in the ocean live and die fast. Phytoplankton or microscopic algae, they die and decompose, or are eaten and decompose or rot within days. And that carbon they pull out of the CO2 they pull out of the air in growing then gets put back as CO2 very quickly. They don't store that carbon. They're very inefficient at that. The only way to make them efficiently store the carbon they remove is to bury them deep in sediments that have no oxygen. Then they won't decompose, and then the carbon gets removed. But in other words, to turn the ocean into a carbon sink, we need to turn the entire ocean into a dead zone, which is not acceptable. It would mean killing all our fisheries, and it would also mean you couldn't live near the coast because of the smell of the hydrogen sulfide coming from the dead anoxic water. So the ocean is really not a solution. The people who are proposing that with geoengineering schemes are, in my view, irresponsible. So the land is where we need to focus. And the land, when we take a look at all the carbon sources and sinks, I've plotted them up here in terms of the rate at which they replace CO2 in the atmosphere, either by adding or subtracting CO2. Ocean and atmosphere exchange all the carbon in the atmosphere about every 10 years or so. But as I say, we can't control that on the source side. If we reduce decomposition and respiration, that's a source will have a big effect on CO2 in the atmosphere, even more than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels takes about 150 years after you reduce it to reduce the level significantly. But at the sinks here, the atmosphere, the oceans we can't control. Sediment burial is way too small, but photosynthesis is the one thing that we can affect. Every 6 years, all the CO2 in the atmosphere cycles through photosynthesis. That CO2 is taken up by a leaf, turned into living matter, then falls, decomposes, and goes through that cycle. So this is our target. Photosynthesis can replace all the CO2 in the atmosphere in the order of 6 years. So if we're able to store a significant proportion of that photosynthesis, we can draw down the excess CO2 literally in decades. It's the only leverage point we have that has the capacity to act fast enough. Now, there's a large number of people in every habitat of the world who have figured out how to restore their own soils. They've done it for their own reasons. They're mostly farmers or people who inherited a bit of land that wasn't very good and they wanted to turn it back to being rich again. And in this book called Geotherapy, which was published last year, it's a 600-page, 34-chapter book, and it contains chapters by people who've used different methods to increase soil fertility in completely different climates, different soil types, different parts of the world, different crops. But they've found ways that work for them in their particular area to make the land much more productive. And many different methods. that are covered in this book. There are about half a dozen different methods we know that have been proven. There are people who've discovered how to do the right thing everywhere. It's quite amazing and how good they do it. And basically what they do is they recycle the elements so that the soil becomes much more fertile. The soils themselves come from the weathering of rocks deep down below the surface, and each rock has a different composition. The rocks are full of the minerals plants need. Plants need more than 20 different elements. So if they have the right elements, they grow very well and very healthily. But if the soil is very old, the nutrients will have been washed out with age. So the old soils become infertile with age. If we want to grow rich crops again on old soils, we've got to replace the missing nutrients and missing elements. And one of the best sources of that are basalt powders or rock powders that contain all the elements plants need except for nitrogen. That you have to provide from compost or something else. But the rock powders contain almost all of these elements. So by adding that, rock powders, for instance, you can get benefits that might last 20 or 50 or more years just by a natural material that acts like a slow-release fertilizer. So rock powders are one of the methods we discuss here in the book, and the people who've gotten quite amazing results in very poor soils simply by making the soil rich again, by addressing the fundamental mineral limitations. Another method that's very important is what we call biochar, which is sort of like an advanced form of charcoal but made at somewhat higher temperature, and that acts again as a nutrient sponge. It sucks up the nutrients, it holds them on the surface, it retains water in the soil, it makes the growing season last longer, it holds the water where the roots can get right to it, and holds it with the nutrients and passes on. So if you mix the biochar with rock powder and with compost, you get an ideal natural material that will last for decades and provide a slow-release natural fertilizer to the plant. So there are many examples of use of biochar in this book too. There are other methods such as advanced pasture management. We're used to think of pastures as methods that run down the soil and burn off the carbon because of overgrazing. But on the other hand, if you manage grazing properly and intensively, you can in fact manage in a way that you're increasing the carbon going into the ground by not letting them overgraze, moving the herds very quickly, having them eat the things they like best, and then fertilize it and mix it into the ground as they go. And that way, if you do it right, you can actually enrich the land instead of impoverishing it. So people have learned all these different techniques. There are organic agriculture methods and subsurface tilling and always keeping the ground in cover crops so that the nutrients are always held by plants, even if you don't harvest the crop. That way you recycle the elements in them. And so by addressing these fundamental issues, in this book we have chapters from every single continent except Antarctica, of people who've developed methods that work. And so the technologies are mature. They work, and they've been used in every habitat we know of. In addition, we've also developed technologies for restoring marine habitats, and that's discussed in this other book, and I'll talk about a little later in this session. So finally, I want to show a bit about terra preta, or biochar. This is not a new technology. It was developed by the Amazonian Indians maybe 5,000 years ago, maybe even 10,000 years ago. We don't really know. But they made the richest soils in the world, these black earths that line the banks of the Amazon River, that are 10 to 40% carbon by weight. And what they discovered is by mixing in their garbage and the remains of bones of fish and turtles and manatees that they cultured in the river, and pottery. You see these pieces of pottery there that bind some of the nutrients. They made incredibly rich soil that has produced crops for 500 years without any fertilizer at all. So this is an example of the biochar, an incredibly rich soil. And again, we've relearned this method now, 500 years after it was lost in the Amazon. And now we can use the process of making biochar to also make green sustainable energy, because that's energy in which we're converting the biomass to produce heat, electricity, liquid fuels, and gaseous fuels. And we're also producing biochar, so that for every gram of energy we produce, we're putting carbon back in the ground and reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's sustainable carbon negative energy. So there's a real possibility now for countries to solve their energy problems and their food problems and their fertility problems and their water problems simultaneously. Well, here's an example of how it works. This is from Rio de Janeiro, and everyone knows the famous bare mountains of Rio de Janeiro, but not many people know that 500 years ago when the Portuguese arrived, they were covered with forests to the very tops. The Portuguese cut down the forest to grow coffee. The soil washed off the mountain peaks and left them as bare rock, and they never recovered. Below them is a spectacular green forest. And people think that's a natural forest, but it isn't, because 200 years ago, they'd cut all of that forest down in order to grow coffee. They had massive soil erosion. The springs dried up, the rivers dried up, and there was no water in the dry season in Rio de Janeiro. The entire population had to leave by boat for months to go someplace up the coast where there were springs because there was no drinking water in Rio de Janeiro. There was no doubt in anyone's mind at that point that they had caused that problem themselves, that it was a human-caused problem, but that they did it by cutting the forest down. And the Emperor of Brazil, Dom Pedro, ordered the city of Rio de Janeiro to hire slaves to go out and climb into the highest mountain peaks of the last remnants of forest remained, and to dig up the little tree seedlings from the natural forest and transplant them and plant a whole forest back where it used to be above Rio de Janeiro. And these gentlemen are environmental heroes. They spent their entire careers, 20 or 30 years, climbing and transplanting trees until they'd planted this huge forest above Rio de Janeiro, the Floresta da Tijuca. And when they planted the forest back, the springs came back, the rivers came back, and that's still a major source of water for Rio de Janeiro. So it works. When we restore the habitat, we restore the ecosystem function, we restore the water supply. The water now, instead of all rushing off immediately when it rains and disappearing and carrying the soil and nutrients into the sea and killing the reefs, now instead when we plant it up, the water is held within the soil, it trickles out very slowly, so now there's a long growing season. So we restore our watersheds and our water cycles, and we restore temperatures too. These are air and soil temperatures for the Amazon, and in the forest, in the undisturbed forest, the temperature only ranged about 1.5 degrees C, day and night. It was always cool, it was always moist. But in a clear-cut area only a couple hundred meters away, where the forest had been cut down and left bare, the temperatures got incredibly hot in the daytime. The soil baked almost white like concrete. The little plants growing in the little layer dried up and died, and it was as if there was drought there. But there's no difference in rain. The difference simply is that the living forest is sucking water up. Half of the heat that lands on land from sunshine goes into evaporating water, and 90% of that goes through plants. It's what we call transpiration. The plant's roots are sucking up water out of the ground, putting it through the trunks. When they open their leaves to take CO2 out of the atmosphere, they lose hundreds or thousands of molecules of water for each molecule of CO2 they grab. So there's a water pump, and that water is carrying the heat of evaporation of that water, and then when it condenses out in rain in the atmosphere, that heat gets released, and that drives the circulation of the atmosphere and the whole pattern of rain over the big continents. So that heat pump not only drives the circulation of the atmosphere, it makes the surface and the land cool. And when we plant back the forest, we get that cooling effect back again. So we can contribute a lot to local cooling by reforesting our watersheds. And so temperature and water are just some of the many services they provide. So in nature, originally, we had a balanced system of photosynthesis, soil organic matter, decomposition, and it was exactly in balance. We've disturbed that. We've disturbed that by mining the soil, letting the carbon be lost, exporting the carbon, running the ecosystem down so it's poorer and poorer and weaker in the basic elements that it needs. That's what we have to do, is we have to restore the balance of the system by storing organic carbon, soil organic matter, and biochar, because biochar lasts so long in the soil. The benefits last thousands and thousands of years. So if we do that, and we do it quickly, we have the hope to stabilize CO2 at safe levels within decades and avoid the worst consequences of global climate change. We need to do that in every ecosystem because most of our soils are already badly degraded. We've lost most of the carbon in it. All of these areas need to be restored in order to be brought back into productivity again. So we have to do large-scale restoration if we want to store CO2 on the ground. This shows organic carbon worldwide in the soil. And about half of the organic carbon in the soil is in wetlands. And about half of the wetland carbon is what we call marine wetlands, mangroves, seagrasses, salt marshes right along the coast, particularly in the tropics. The French government has proposed that countries increase the amount of carbon in their soils by 0.4% a year. And the idea of that is to reduce the increase of CO2 and stabilize it. It's not enough. We need to lower the CO2 down to safe levels, but it's the first serious proposal any government ever made in 25 years of failure at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Unfortunately, the French government proposed it on December 1st, but it did not make it into the final draft of the treaty that was issued on December 12th. So that was negotiated away, and we need to bring back, it's the only hope we have for preventing runaway climate change. This treaty needs to be much stronger than the French proposed. We need to draw down that excess CO2. We need to invest in the soils, agriculture, pasture land, the restoration of habitats, all needs to be implicitly and explicitly mentioned in the treaty, and right now they're not. So we've missed the opportunity to solve our problem by getting rid of the dangerous excess. And we have to do that by tending our gardens.